If you have ever been quietly written off by someone who never bothered to read the whole page, stay right here, because this story was made for you. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss another story from the Karma Diaries by Uncle Sammy. The Karma Diaries never lies. The night my wife had me locked out of my own life, I was standing in the driveway of the house I had paid for in a city that still did not know my full name, holding a bag of dry cleaning, and listening to the sound of a dinner party happening on the other side of my own front door. It was a Saturday in late October, the kind of evening that arrives in Memphis already cold, with a wind that comes off the river and finds every gap in whatever you are wearing. I had been at the office until 6:30, finishing load calculations on a bid that was due Monday morning. I had not been invited to whatever was happening inside. I learned about the dinner from a text Vivian sent at 4:15 that afternoon. A single line, breezy and complete. Having some people over tonight. Probably easier if you stay late at the office or grab dinner somewhere. I'll explain later. I had read it twice, standing at my drafting table with a pencil still in my hand, and then I had set the phone down and finished the calculations. I did not call. I did not argue. I was, by nature and by long practice, a man who gave people room and waited to understand before he responded. That was a thing Vivian had never forgiven me for. She called it passivity. I called it precision. We had been having that argument silently for 6 years. I was 38 years old, and I had been married to Vivian Osawade for 6 years, and in that time she constructed a version of me that was clean, comprehensible, and entirely incomplete. She knew I ran a structural engineering firm called Meridian Design Group out of a converted warehouse space in Midtown Memphis, 2 blocks off Union Avenue. She knew I worked long hours. She knew I drove a sensible gray sedan, wore unremarkable clothes, and had the particular stillness of a man who was comfortable taking up less space than he occupied. She had assessed me at 29, decided she understood what I was, and had never once gone back to check the measurement. What Vivian did not know, and had never asked, was that the firm was not the whole picture. My grandfather, Coleridge Ashford, had spent 40 years as a maintenance supervisor for the Memphis School District, fixing other people's buildings during the day and buying parcels of land at night. Small lots at first. In neighborhoods people were fleeing, then larger ones as the neighborhoods began the slow turn back. He had been methodical and patient and entirely invisible about it. And when he died, the inventory of what he built was a quiet shock to everyone except my grandmother, who had known every number and said nothing for 4 decades because he had asked her not to. The land trust he left me was managed through a holding entity called the Ashford Land Group, registered under his mother's name. No Meridian, no Wade, no thread anyone could pull without already knowing where to look. By the time Vivian and I married, the trust had grown through careful reinvestment to just over $3 million in appraised assets, with 2 parcels under active development in the Binghamton corridor, one of which had been quietly selected as a preferred site for a municipal transit facility. My attorney knew, my accountant knew, my grandmother knew, my cousin Dion knew, nobody else. I had not hidden it from Vivian out of strategy. I had simply been waiting for her to ask. She never asked. Not about the land. Not about trust. Not about the quarterly calls of the attorneys or the site visits I folded into my irregular hours or the conversations I had with city planners that sometimes ran long and explained why I was late to things she wanted me to be on time for. She had drawn her circle around what she could see and decided it was sufficient. And everything outside the circle she had attributed to professional dullness, the texture of a man whose ambitions were modest and whose life was, in her word, contained. She said it once, not to me, but on a phone call I was not supposed to hear, and the word had settled into me without ceremony and stayed. The dinner party had 12 people by the sound of it. I sat in my car in the driveway for 11 minutes before I made a decision. I backed out. I drove to my grandmother's house on Roselle Street, a narrow shotgun house she had lived in for 51 years, with a porch light that was always on and a kitchen that always smelled like coffee and something baking even when nothing was in the oven. I let myself in with my key. She was in her chair with the news on low and a cup of tea balanced on the arm of it. She looked at me with the specific expression she used when she had already understood something before I opened my mouth. "How long has it been going on?" she said. before I sat down. I told her I did not know. I told her about the text. I told her about the dinner I had not been invited to and the man whose name I had heard her say with a particular fluency of someone who had said it many times in private. His name was Roland Fitch. He was a commercial real estate developer, the kind who showed up at city council meetings in expensive jackets and said the right things about community investment. I had met him twice. He had a firm handshake and the specific confidence of someone who had never once questioned whether a room was his. My grandmother listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she said, "What do you need?" I told her I needed a week and some quiet. She told me I had both. I stayed for 2 hours and ate chicken and rice I had not asked for and drove home at 9:30 to a house that was clean and empty and smelled faintly of something floral and expensive. Vivian was in the bedroom with the door pulled most of the way closed, her voice low on the phone. I set my dry cleaning on the hook in the hallway and went to my office and closed the door. I sat at my desk for a while without opening anything. Then I took out a legal pad and wrote one line at the top of a clean page, the way I recorded things I needed to come back to. 6 years. She has never once asked. The storage facility was on the south end of Lamar Avenue, between a transmission shop and a row of industrial units that kept the kind of inventory that did not require explanation. I had rented Unit 7 for 4 years. I arrived there at 5:45 on a Sunday morning, in the particular quiet that Memphis has before the city remembers itself, that low hum of it, the river somewhere beyond everything, steady and indifferent. I parked at the far end, away from the fluorescent overhead, and walked to the unit and keyed in the code. The door lifted with the soft mechanical resistance it always had, and inside, the air was controlled and still. The car was under a fitted black cover that I had purchased the same week I brought it here. Lamborghini Urus, pearl white, 3 years old, fewer than 2,000 miles on it. I had bought it the year I turned 36, 2 weeks after the Ashford Land Group finalized its first major development return, with a check that was larger than anything I had held in my hands before, and that I had folded carefully and deposited without ceremony. I had driven the car from Nashville where I purchased it, brought it here, and covered it. I drove it on the third Sunday of each month, always before 8 in the morning, always alone, always back before Vivian was awake. Not because I was hiding it, because some things did not require an audience. I pulled the cover back from the hood and rested my palm flat against the paint. It was cool and smooth and entirely itself in the fluorescent light of the storage unit, indifferent to whether anyone was looking. I had bought it for the same reason my grandfather had bought his first parcel of land in a neighborhood people were leaving. Not because anyone expected it, but because I had built something and I was allowed to own the evidence of it. I had never shown Vivian because she had never asked what I had built. She had asked what I earned. She had asked what our tax return would look like. She had never once asked what I had built. I covered the car again, smoothed the edges, and drove home in my sensible gray sedan. The Founders Circle Gala was the largest charitable event in Memphis every year, hosted by the Whitmore Foundation, which funded pediatric literacy programs across 6 counties. I had been a private underwriting contributor for 3 years, which meant the event could not proceed without my signature on the annual investment agreement, and Vivian had attended the gala every year on the strength of her hospital's donor table, without ever knowing that the organization's solvency had my name folded quietly inside it. I had confirmed my attendance for this year by email on a Tuesday. The event chair, a woman named Sandra Lofton, who had been the foundation's director for 12 years, had sent back a response that contained more exclamation points than I was accustomed to from a formal professional exchange. On Thursday evening, Vivian mentioned the gala the way she mentioned weather, as a fact of the coming week that required no particular discussion. She said she had been seated at the hospital board table, that Roland had arranged the table positioning through his philanthropic committee connections, and that it should be a strong evening for the hospital's capital campaign. She said all of this to the kitchen counter while she sorted through her phone, and she said it with the fluency of a woman who has been preparing sentences in advance and is now delivering them naturally. She did not mention me. She did not invite me. She said, almost as an afterthought, that the tables were fully committed and it would be difficult to add a seat last minute. I said I understood. I said I might find something to do with the evening. She said that sounded like a good idea, and she refilled her water glass and went back to her phone. And the kitchen settled into the particular quiet it had in the evenings when we were in the same room and occupying entirely different territories. I rinsed my cup. I went to my office. I sat at my desk and stared at the wall for about 4 minutes. Then I called Sandra Lofton's personal cell number, which I had because she had given it to me herself at the previous year's event when I finally accepted her standing invitation to meet in person. I confirmed I would attend. Sandra said she was thrilled and that she had been waiting 3 years to say that. I called my attorney the following morning. Gerald Tatum had handled the Ashford Land Group's legal work for 7 years, a methodical and economical man who asked only the questions that were necessary and kept his own counsel about everything else. I gave him the outline of what I needed. Not everything, not yet. He said he would have preliminary documentation prepared by the end of week. He asked if I had a timeline in mind. I said I would call him Friday. He said he would be ready. That was the whole conversation. An hour later, I called a clothier named Marcus Pierce, who worked out a private studio in East Memphis and dressed people whose names appeared in the business section of the Commercial Appeal and occasionally beyond it. The appointment was Thursday morning. Marcus asked one question. What was the occasion? I told him it was a formal gala, an evening event, and that I wanted something that did not try to say anything. He nodded and said nothing for about 10 seconds, which I had been told was his way of beginning to work. The suit he put me in was charcoal black with a thread count that I could not have described, but that the fabric communicated without needing description. He said, when I asked about the pocket square, that white was always correct when you were certain. I told him I was certain. He said he could see that. I stopped by my cousin Dion's apartment on Friday evening and told him everything. Dion had been my closest friend since we were 7 years old, sharing a back pew at Greater Harvest Missionary Baptist Church, while our grandmothers traded recipes in low voices during announcements. He listened to the full account, the text, the dinner party, Roland Fitch's name, the storage unit, the gala, with the particular stillness of someone who was already several steps ahead of the narrative. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and looked at me for a long moment. She doesn't know about the car, he said. It was not a question. I said no. He said, I want to come. I said I was counting on it. The week between that conversation and the gala was ordinary on the surface. I made dinner on 2 evenings. I asked Vivian how her day went and listened to the answers. I moved to the house with the same easy presence I had always brought to our shared space, and she received it the way she always had, as confirmation that everything was as she had understood it to be. On Wednesday, she purchased a gown, emerald green, structure at the shoulder. She showed it to me, and I said it was striking because honesty in the small things cost me nothing now. She thanked me with the brief warmth she used when something I did aligned with her expectations. Thursday night, I drove to the storage unit at 11:15. The lot was empty. The overhead light buzzed in its familiar frequency. I unlocked the unit and raised the door and pulled the cover off completely, letting it fall behind the rear bumper. I got in. The interior smelled like leather, and the cedar blocks I kept on the floor mats. I adjusted my seat. I rested both hands on the wheel. Then I turned the key. The Urus started on the first try. The engine settled into a low register, unhurried, deep, like something that had simply been waiting with complete confidence that the moment would eventually arrive. I sat in the storage unit and listened to it idle. Then I cut the engine and covered the car and drove home and went to bed and slept without difficulty. The Whitmore Foundation Gala was held at the Peabody Hotel's Grand Ballroom on the evening of the third Saturday in October. The Peabody knows exactly what it is, and its ballroom reflects that knowledge. Warm light from chandeliers that have been there long enough to stop trying, cream and gold linens, flowers that are tall without being aggressive. It is a room that understands its own authority and does not require the people inside it to confirm it. Vivian arrived at 7:15 with Roland Fitch. She wore the emerald gown. She moved through the entrance with the practiced ease of a woman who had been preparing for rooms like this one her entire adult life. And she carried herself in a way that said she had arrived somewhere she intended to stay. Roland held her elbow lightly as they were directed toward the hospital board table, a prime placement near the stage, the kind of positioning that communicated priority without announcing it. He was well turned out. Black tuxedo, clean posture, the relaxed confidence of a man who had decided in advance that the room would receive him well, and had walked in already comfortable with that conclusion. He said the right things to the right people. He shook hands with the alderman. He introduced himself to the hospital CFO with a fluency that suggested he had done his research. Vivian watched him work the room and felt, for the first time in months, that everything was proceeding precisely as she had planned. 40 minutes into the cocktail hour, Sandra Lofton approached the podium. Sandra was in her late 50s, silver-laced natural hair, the kind of presence that did not need amplification, but used a microphone out of courtesy to the room. She welcomed the guests. She acknowledged the committee chairs. She thanked the table sponsors by name, and the room gave each acknowledgement its appropriate warmth. Then she shifted just slightly, and the room adjusted with her, the way it does when someone is about to say something that matters. "I want to take a moment," she said, "to recognize the Foundation's private underwriting contributors. These are the individuals whose investment makes this evening possible," Sandra continued, "whose generosity sustains our grant program, and whose commitment to Memphis children we do not take lightly." She paused. "As a rule, they prefer not to be named. For 3 years running, one contributor in particular has asked to remain anonymous, and for 3 years I have honored that request." A small, knowing ripple of laughter moved through the sections of the room that already understood who she was talking about. "He is here in person this evening for the first time, and tonight I am afraid his modesty is simply not going to hold." Vivian had her champagne glass halfway to her mouth. She set it down. "Please join me in recognizing Kendrick Ashford Wade of the Ashford Land Group and Meridian Design Group, whose underwriting has made this gala possible for 3 consecutive years, and whose infrastructure and design work is about to reshape 3 neighborhoods in this city in ways that will be felt for a generation." The applause was not polite. It was full. It was a particular sound of a room that recognizes a name being confirmed rather than introduced and understands the difference between those two things. Vivian heard the name. She did not move. She was holding her champagne glass. She had not set it down again after all. She simply held it and heard the name and felt the ground beneath her perform a slow, structural shift. Roland went still beside her. She felt it without looking. The main doors opened. Kendrick walked in. The suit was charcoal black, and it did not announce itself. It did not have to. It was a kind of garment that made every other suit in the room quietly aware of its own approximation. His cousin Dion walked beside him, composed, his chin level, wearing the expression of a man who had been waiting a long time for the specific walk across the specific floor. On his other side was an older woman, his grandmother Lucille, in a deep burgundy gown and pearl earrings, moving the way people move when they are long past needing anyone's confirmation of anything. Sandra met Kendrick at the entrance and took both his hands, and then pulled him into the easy embrace of 2 people who have been working colleagues for years and are comfortable in the same room. An alderman crossed the floor before Kendrick had taken 4 steps inside. A developer whose name Vivian recognized, a name Roland had been trying to arrange an introduction to for months, extended his hand and held it to a beat-pass ceremony. A woman in a beaded blazer who edited the city's longest-running business journal moved toward Kendrick with purpose and said something direct and close, and Kendrick smiled, the smile of a man who had expected to be asked. Through the floor-to-ceiling lobby glass, a car sat in the valet turnaround, pearl white, wide-shouldered, absolutely still in the way of things that have always known their own worth. 3 guests near the window had already turned. One of them said something to the valet attendant, and the attendant answered, and whatever name passed between them moved through that small cluster with a particular weight of information, landing exactly where it was designed to land. Vivian looked at the car. She had never seen it before in her life. She had driven past the storage unit on Lamar Avenue 100 times and never thought to wonder what was inside Unit 7. She had not known about the Ashford Land Group. She had not known about the underwriting. She had not known that for 3 consecutive years a man, she told her best friend she had settled for, had been signing the document that made this evening legally and financially possible. She had not known about the car, the land parcels, the development in Binghamton, the municipal transit site, the attorney's calls, or the quarterly disbursements. She had not known because she had not asked. She had drawn her circle and trusted it, and every choice she had made in the past 14 months. including the one standing beside her in a rented tuxedo, had been built on top of measurements she had taken once and never revisited. Kendrick was 20 feet away and moving through a current of genuine recognition that the room generated naturally around him. The way water moves around a structure that has always been load-bearing. He had not looked in her direction. Then he did, briefly, just long enough. There was nothing staged in his expression, no satisfaction, no performance of any kind. He simply saw her clearly, with the specific calm of a man who had already finished every decision that required finishing. Then he turned back to the alderman and laughed at something that was genuinely funny. Easily, fully. The laugh of a man who was exactly where it always belonged and had simply stopped pretending otherwise. The sound of it reached her across the room. She stood in her emerald gown with the champagne glass. She had never put down and watched her husband exist in a room she had told him he would struggle to enter. She understood, with the particular clarity that arrives without mercy, that she had spent 6 years confidently reading a man whose full text she had never once opened. Roland said something beside her. She did not hear what it was. She smiled a smile she kept ready for rooms like this and said something appropriate and turned back to the table. And the evening continued around her like water, continuing to move. She came in before midnight. Her heels were in her hand. Kendrick was in the kitchen, a lamp above the stove on, the rest of the room in a comfortable shadow. He was in a plain shirt and sweatpants, sitting at the table with a cup of tea and a legal pad, writing something. He looked up when she came in. "Hey," he said. "How was it?" She said it was fine. She said there was a longer debrief than expected, and that Sandra ran those things long. He said he knew, which was true. She moved to the counter, poured water, stood with her back to him for just long enough. Then she turned around and looked at him over the rim of her glass and said, "Big turnout." He said it sounded like it. She nodded. She set the glass in the sink. She went upstairs. She did not sleep. She lay in the dark, reading messages the way you read a structural report after something has already failed. Carefully, looking for where the load had been misunderstood. "Your husband just left. Vivian, what a remarkable man. I had no idea about his work with the foundation. I didn't know about the land group at all. We should have lunch." That was from the hospital board member whose approval Vivian had been quietly engineering for 18 months. The woman had spent 14 minutes talking to Kendrick and used the word remarkable without qualification. Vivian read it 3 times and set the phone face down on the nightstand. In the morning, he made coffee and set her mug at the angle she preferred. The handle turned slightly left, the way she had told him she liked in the first month of their marriage, and that he had never once failed to do so since. She came downstairs already composed, already inside the version of herself she showed the world. She poured the coffee. She looked at him across the kitchen island. He was reading something on his phone, unhurried. She wanted to say something that would let her understand what she was looking at. She did not have a language yet, because the language required her to acknowledge what she had missed, and acknowledging it required going back over 6 years of mornings and evenings and dinner table conversations, and rereading all of them against a context she had chosen not to gather. His associate, a woman named Petra who ran operations at Meridian Design Group, called him at 2 in the afternoon. Vivian did not hear the conversation. She was between meetings at the hospital, standing in the hallway outside the conference room, reading a text from Roland about how the evening had gone, whether she was worried, whether they needed to recalibrate the timeline on the condo application. The condo. She had been patient about the condo. She had a strategy, a carefully sequenced plan that her attorney had laid out in the preliminary consultation 3 weeks ago. Wait until the municipal transit contract was announced, because filed before the announcement the contract's value was theoretical, and filed after it was documented and calculable. She was going to be patient. She had 14 months of practice. Kendrick called his attorney on Monday. Gerald Tatum answered on the second ring. The conversation was brief and specific. By Thursday, the divorce filing was submitted. The marital home, purchased entirely on his income over 6 years, was structurally and documentably his. The Ashford Land Group, established 4 years before the marriage, maintained in complete separation, had never been marital property. Her attorney reviewed the structure twice. There was no viable challenge. There was no thread to pull because the thing had been built correctly, years before she decided what was worth. Vivian sat across from Kendrick in the living room on a Tuesday evening. He had asked her to be home. He had not said why in a way that required an explanation. 2 glasses of water on the table. Evening light through the front window. He told her what he had heard in the hallway at the dinner party in October. The exact words. Because he had replayed them enough times that they had settled into him the way data settles. Precisely. He placed the hotel receipt on the table. He placed the documents her attorney would eventually review, each in the order they had been assembled, each turned so she could read it without having to reach. He did not raise his voice. He did not itemize her failures. He said one thing at the end, quietly, the way he said things he had thought about for a long time. I would have shown you any of it, all of it, if you had ever asked. Then he stood and walked to his office and closed the door. Vivian sat alone at the table with the documents in front of her. The receipt, the land trust summary, the development parcels, the filing timestamp that told her, without ambiguity, that the man she had been outpacing had filed 9 days before she ever sat down with her attorney. She had believed she was the one who was ahead. She sat with that understanding, and the evening light finished leaving the room, and the house went quiet around her. What came apart slowly. The divorce settled on Kendrick's timeline because he had filed first and prepared the longest. Roland's condo application, the one that had listed combined household income to clear the credit threshold, the one that Vivian's attorney had reviewed with careful concern, created its own complications when the underwriting disclosures were examined. Nothing criminal was established, but questions were asked, and questions of that kind have a way of traveling. Roland found other interests. He did not call often. When he did call, Vivian did not always answer, and eventually the calling became infrequent enough that the not answering became the whole relationship. Vivian resigned from the hospital board before the conflict of interest review was formalized. She framed it as a voluntary transition. She said she was pursuing new opportunities in healthcare administration. She delivered every line with the composure of a woman who had spent years managing how things appeared, right up until the moment the thing she was managing was herself. She was not charged with anything. Her involvement had never been demonstrable in the way that required that kind of consequence. But the professional standing she had built across 6 years of careful positioning did not survive the geometry of what she had been part of. She landed at a medical administration company, in a quieter role. The life she had chosen over her marriage was smaller than the one she had left, and smaller than she had expected the leaving to cost. The municipal transit contract was announced on a Thursday in December. Kendrick's name appeared in the Memphis Business Journal beside a photograph taken on the Binghamton site. Kendrick in a hard hat and a heavy jacket, looking at something outside the frame with the expression of a man who already knows what he is building. The Ashford Land Group was named as a primary community stakeholder. Sandra Lofton sent a handwritten card. His grandmother Lucille called and said, simply, "Your grandfather would have liked this week." Dion took him to dinner at a place on Cooper Young that was loud and good and required a reservation. Kendrick ate the whole thing and said very little and was exactly where he was supposed to be. He had the Urus moved from the storage unit to the garage of the house, which was his house now without condition or qualifier. He drove on a Sunday morning in January, windows down in the cold, through Midtown and down Union Avenue and past a warehouse building where Meridian Design Group occupied 2 floors and had recently signed a 3rd. He drove past Greater Harvest Missionary Baptist Church, where he and Dion had shared a back pew for 20 years and where his grandmother still sat in the same seat she had occupied since 1974. He parked in the lot and sat in the car for a moment, the engine idled low and steady. He had spent 6 years being a smaller version of himself for an audience that had made his assessment and stopped looking. He was done with the storage unit. He was done with the tarp. Dion was promoted to associate director at Meridian, a title that had been accurate in practice for 2 years and was now accurate on paper. His grandmother Lucille had a standing Thursday lunch at the office, where she sat in a chair by the window and was brought tea in a real ceramic mug by the staff who had been told she was the reason the firm existed. She received this with the satisfaction of a woman who had been patient for a very long time and had known, with the specific certainty of someone who had watched the whole thing from the beginning, how it was going to come out. One afternoon in February, she looked at Kendrick across the table with the expression she used when she was about to say something true. She never once asked, Lucille said. It was not an accusation. It was observation, the way a structural engineer observes a load distributed wrong. Not with blame, but with a clear-eyed understanding of where the failure was located. Kendrick looked at her for a moment. No, he said. She didn't. Lucille wrapped both hands around her ceramic mug. A person who never asks doesn't want to know, she said. They want to be right. She sipped her tea. Kendrick looked out the window at Union Avenue, at the city go about itself in the winter light. He thought about what it had cost him to be knowable and unchosen at the same time. Then he picked up his pencil and went back to the site drawings, because the work was still there, and the work had always been the part that was fully his. He drove to Nashville in March. There was a conference on sustainable urban infrastructure. 2 days, a hotel off Broadway, good speakers, long evenings. On the second night after the dinner session, he sat at the hotel bar and ordered one drink and stared at the bottle behind the counter and thought about his grandfather buying land that no one else was buying, in neighborhoods no one else believed in, quietly for 40 years. He thought about what it meant to build something that no one was watching. He thought about the fact that watching had never been the point. The point was the building. The watching was just what happened afterward when the thing you built turned out to hold. He was back in Memphis by Friday. The spring site visits on the Binghamton parcels were scheduled for the following week. There was a second municipal engagement in the early conversation stage, a storm drainage redesign in South Memphis that would take 3 years and was exactly the kind of slow, structural, unglamorous work that Kendrick was built for. Dion handled the intake calls. The firm's letterhead had a new line. His grandmother had lunch on Thursdays. The Urus was in the garage. The storage unit on Lamar Avenue was empty, cleaned out, and returned to facility manager with a month's notice paid in full. There was nothing left in storage. Everything he was already out in the open, and the open was large enough to hold all of it. If this story moved you, do not let it end here. Like this video and share it with someone who has been quietly building something that the wrong person never thought to look at. Subscribe to the Karma Diaries by Uncle Sammy for stories that go all the way to the truth. The Karma Diaries never lies. The end.